All right, well, welcome. This morning is a great morning to be here because this is the first service, the first message in our sermon series through the book of Judges. You can see the artwork. I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Eric Weathers because it was his artistic ability that put this together. If you guys didn't know, we have a really fantastic artist, multiple, but Eric is being one of them among us. The book of Judges. This book is a book that I've been looking forward to preaching for many years, actually. Before I even moved to Wichita, this book is a book I've wanted to preach. Some of you know, many of you may not, that Pastor Zach and myself, we went to seminary together. We knew each other back in Massachusetts, and our families knew each other. And I remember telling him years ago that, man, when I get into a church, I cannot wait to preach the book of Judges. Now, why would I want to preach through the book of Judges? After all, the book of Judges is a book that a lot of people are not super familiar with. And if you are familiar with it, then you know that it is a book that is full of violence, gore. It's gritty. It's offensive. At times, it's even stomach-turning and appalling. So why preach through a book like this? Well, to do that, I feel like I need to give a rationale for it, right? So this morning, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a rationale on why we should preach through the book of Judges, and then I want to give us an overview of the book of Judges. And then next week, we will dive into the text. We'll dive into Judges 1 and continue through the story. So first, the rationale. Why would I preach through the book of Judges? There are many other books that we have yet to preach through as a church. There are many other books that are far more lighthearted and less gruesome. I mean, in the first few verses of Judges chapter 1, we find out that these kings cut off 70 thumbs and 70 toes and sent them away, and that's fairly minor compared to what the book of Judges has to offer. So why would we do this? Well, the rationale I would give is because the book of Judges is a great story. It's a really good story, and it contains many great stories within it. So you might be thinking, that's not really a good reason to preach through it, just because it's a good story. And I would want to oppose a little bit on that. I would actually say, no, this is why we should preach through the book of Judges. Over the last few years, this concept, this idea of the power of story has been on my mind quite a bit. And when we think about the power of story, we see that story is everywhere. It changes everything. Everything in life, in your life, in my life, and our life collectively is a part of a story. There are good stories and there are bad stories. There are true stories and there are false stories. There are comedies and there are tragedies. And when we want to get to know somebody, what do we ask them? Hey, what's your story? Tell me your story. I want to get to know you. We relate to one another in the context of story. Story changes people. Stories form community, and they build up and they can tear down empires. And God has woven his story into every fiber of the universe. The Psalms say that the heavens declare the glory of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. What is that? The heavens tell us a story about the glory of God. And if we listen, we will hear that story. If we look, we will see that story. The heavens, the creation itself, is telling us a story about who God is. Story is how God communicates the realities of his glorious beauty to his creation. Apart from story, God's glorious beauty is left unexpressed. Whenever somebody asks you about how your day has been, they are asking you to share part of your story. If someone comes up and asks you a question, the answer you give them is an answer that you have generated in your past as a part of your story. You were in a certain place and time, talking to somebody, reading something, listening to something that allowed you to get the answer to the question this person is asking. So even answering a question is to bring your story into the present, your past story into the present, and share it with the one you're talking to. Story is everywhere. Salvation itself is Jesus Christ entering into your story and baptizing you into his. This is the power of story. My kids love to hear stories. particularly, they love to hear stories about my childhood. Whenever something happens, they often ask, Dad, when you were a kid, did you ever fall off your bike? Dad, when you were a kid, did you ever were you afraid of this or that? Dad, when you were a kid, did you get in trouble for this same thing? They want to know the stories of their parents. A couple weeks ago, I was gone for a week, and my mom came out to spend time with Mandy and the kids while I was gone. When I got home, my mom, their grandmother, filled their catalog, packed full of stories from when I was a kid. So I get home, and the kids right away say, hey, Dad, we heard that you didn't like your name growing up. I said, what are you talking about? Yeah, you were upset that you didn't have a Bible name. I said, yeah, I was. I still am, actually, My older brother's name is Luke. My younger brother's name is Jacob. And my name is Kyle. I feel like I got the short end of the stick on this one, Why, Mom and Dad, couldn't I have a Bible name like my brothers? I was also upset because they both had brown eyes. I had green eyes, so I was like, my mom had green eyes, so I thought they were kind of girly. I was like, man, I wish I had brown eyes like the boys. They asked me to tell the story. Hey, Dad, we heard that when you were 2, you got into a car and drove it. I was like, well, it's not that significant. But yeah, when I was 2 years old, we were at my grandparents' house, and like all parents do, we buckle the kids into the car. You turn it on to keep it warm because I was in New Hampshire and there's snow everywhere. My parents were inside saying goodbye, and I figured a way out of my car seat, got into the driver's seat, put that bad boy into gear, looked over the steering wheel. I almost hit my grandfather's new town car. My mom said my grandfather had a bad back. My mom said she has never seen her father run that fast as when he saw me almost hit his town car. See, these are stories. These are stories that we need to share. These are stories that our kids want to hear. In fact, they need to hear these stories. So why is that? Why is it that kids want to know? Why is it so important to our children that they know the stories of their parents? It's because of the power of story. Story forms identity. Kids learn who they are by hearing the story of their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, their aunts and their uncles, their neighbors. They form their identity by hearing stories. And if we're honest, we don't outgrow that. In fact, there's an industry out there that is making a lot of money by taking your DNA, putting it into a system, and sending you the results, like 23andMe or something like that, sending you the results so that you can know your story. Where are you from? Where are your parents from? Where are your grandparents? What is your lineage? We want to know these things because those stories form us. They change us. They help us know how to live, how to move forward in life, who we are. Story is so powerful, and it's happening all the time. It's happening at this moment. Right? We're living this out right now. Your story is that you've come to Exodus Church, and we have sung songs together. And you're hearing me talk to you, and our stories are interchanged or intersecting, and you are being changed by it, and I'm being changed by you. Right? Our stories are coming together constantly. And that's good, and that's right. For it is through story that we learn and grow. It is through story that our identities are formed. It is through story that we find truth, goodness, and beauty. If you think about it, without story, there's really no direction in life. There's no direction in life. Without story, truth is unattainable. Without story, there is no meaning in life. Meaning just floats away. This is one of the main problems with postmodernity. Postmodernism, they fundamentally want to reject the idea of a meta-narrative. And a meta-narrative is the overarching story of humanity, right? That's one of the best ways to describe it, though it's more nuanced than that, but it's the overarching story of humanity. And they realize the power of story. So for a lot of people who would say, I don't want to be a part of this story. I want to remove myself from the meta-narrative and create my own story. I should not be under the authority of this other story. It has no bearing on me, but rather, I want to have my own story. You want to have your own story. And this other story it doesn't affect me. I shouldn't be enslaved to that. But the problem is, truth and goodness and meaning and beauty is all found in the context of story. So if we try to divorce ourselves from the meta-narrative, the overarching story, we step into a world of relativism and subjectivism, right? It's whatever I want it to be. My story is my story, your story is your story, and we can just live happily ever after. And that is one of the reasons we see many of the trends we see in our world today, is a divorcing from the story that is around us and through us and above us that we are a part of. In fact, we see that the Bible itself is and gives us the meta-narrative. It is the overarching story. To hold on to meaning, to hold on to truth, we must hold on to this story. And the reason that this is true is because God is the great storyteller. God, who is the source of all meaning and truth, has revealed himself in and through story. So we must not divorce ourselves, but rather we must embrace that. We must embrace the meta-narrative, the great story of the Bible. The biblical meta-narrative is overarching. It's all-embracing. It is a story that all humankind and all of their stories fit into. The biblical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and recreation is the all-embracing story, the meta-narrative for all peoples of all ages. For the biblical story is the story that all humanity is brought into. The story of humanity begins in the garden. And then we see the story finishing and being concluded in a garden city. Genesis 1 and 2, the end of Revelation. This is the story that we are a part of. All of our lives, all of our stories fit into this one grand story that God is telling. He is the great storyteller. And we are all a part of his story. We all live in God's creation, whether we want to admit it or not. We exist, we live in God's creation. We have all fallen by the curse of sin. We are all struggling to find our place in this story. We all live under the authority of King Jesus. When Jesus says in the Great Commission, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, we say, okay, do we believe it or not? And whether we believe it or not doesn't really change the reality. All authority is given to Christ, both in heaven and on earth. So the question for us, as we live our lives, as we are characters in this story, are we going to be characters that submit to his kingship? Are we going to tell, are our stories going to reflect and move the story of the gospel forward? Or are we going to live in rebellion to his kingship? Is that the character we're going to be? And these are questions you must ask. Are you going to live under the authority of King Jesus? What sort of character are you? What sort of character will you be in this story that is being lived out moment by moment? We must place our faith and allegiance in the King of Kings. So for us to live faithfully before Christ, it is massively important that we know this story. If meaning and truth and identity is found in the biblical story, in the meta-narrative of Jesus Christ, creation, fall, redemption, recreation, if that is where our identities are found, we must know the story to know how to live, right? We must know the story of our father Abraham and his unrelenting faith. We must know the story of Esther and her bravery and how she trusted God even in the face of death. We must know these stories. They must get into our bones if we are to live faithfully before him, because we are formed by story. Our identities are formed. We must not forget the story. For Jesus Christ has brought you by his blood and resurrection. He has brought you into his story. Now let us live faithfully as members of this grand narrative that is being played out. So, why preach the book of Judges? Because it's a great story. And we need it. You need it. I need it. I need to know how to live in this world, and you need to know how to live in this world. And we learn how to live in this world by knowing the story. And Judges is a chapter of that story that is often neglected. It's often ignored because it's a hard one to look at. It's a struggle because of the content of Judges. So if you would, everybody raise your hands. I want to kind of illustrate this point. Everybody, raise your hands. Okay. Now, if you have never heard a sermon on the book of Judges, you've never heard one, put your hands down. Okay, a group, okay. Now, if you've never heard a sermon on the book of Judges other than Samson or Gideon and Deborah, we'll put her in there too, put your hands down. Okay, good. Now, if you have never sat through an entire sermon series on the book of Judges, put your hands down. Okay, this is way better than, we have 3 times as many people in this service than we did in the last. That's good. You can all put your hands down now. But this illustrates the point. We as a people are not familiar with the book of Judges. It is not one that is often preached from. It's not one that is often read. And again, the reason for that is because it is a violent, gritty, and disturbing book. If the book of Judges were put into a movie, it would without a doubt be rated R. Judges records what it looks like for God's people to turn their back on God and fully embrace the idols of the day. And what does that do to image bearers of God? What does that do to us when we reject God, the storyteller? Say, I'm going to create my own story. I'm going to live as a character that wants to create his own destiny. Well, the book of Judges gives us a glimpse into that life and that reality. However, as shocking as the book of Judges is, whether it's cutting off fingers and toes or other things that we will see, the most shocking thing about the book of Judges is not the horrors of the people's sins, but it is the glory of God's faithfulness and salvation for those people. That's the most shocking thing about the book of Judges. When you read through this and you see the people of God just spiraling out of control. Their thoughts, their motives, their desires, everything evil, despising God, yet God's faithfulness to his people. That is a shock. That is the great, powerful message of the book of Judges, is God's faithfulness toward a people who are not faithful at all, who are faithless. This is why we need to know the story of the Judges. Because the terror of sin in this book is outshone only by God's salvation worked through these judges who then point us to Jesus Christ. This is why we must know these stories, because they tell us how to live in our day. For us to understand the greatness of God, we must know the stories of those who came before us. We must know about our fathers and mothers in the faith. We need to know about the wit of Ehud. We need to know about Shamgar and his ox goad. Our daughters need to see the bravery of Jael, and our sons need to see the strength of Samson. We need the book of Judges. We need to know about the serpent figures who get their heads crushed throughout the book of Judges. For these stories form our story. And along with the judges, we have been brought into God's redemption. Of God's grace and mercy, we must learn to walk rightly before him. And as we make our way through the book of Judges, we will see how each of these stories prepare us for the ultimate judge who is to come, Jesus Christ. We will see that the gospel story is laced throughout the book of Judges. And not only that, right? Not only do we see this beautiful picture of Christ and his gospel throughout Judges, but when we look at our world today and we look at the books of the Bible, Judges may be one of the most culturally relevant books for us to know and to read. I mean, think about some of the themes that come up in the book of Judges. We have tension and strife between rival groups, mainly in the Middle East. That sounds somewhat familiar. We have disputes over land and territory. There's uncertainty over the roles of men and women. There's power-hungry political leaders. There's child abuse. There's spouse abuse. There's senseless and excessive violence. There is this extreme individualism that comes up. There's moral confusion. There's social chaos. These are all things that when we go this week, we will experience and see all of these things before us. And the Judges will give us a good guide of how to interpret and how to work through or walk through the world that we live faithfully as characters in God's story, bringing about his glory and his kingdom. So hearing these stories will help us. And right now, what I want to do is kind of give us a landscape, right? So that's the rationale. Judges is a really good story. And we need good stories to know how to live. And we also want to have a landscape of the book of Judges as we dive into it next week. All right? So the book of Judges it fills the historical gap between Joshua and King Saul, right? You have the 12 tribes of Israel. They finally come into the land. And then about 400 years later, we have King Saul that comes about. So what happens in those 400 or so years? And that's what the book of Judges covers. So if we were to zoom out just a little bit, we would see that the book of Judges falls in this place within the biblical narrative, right? It starts in Genesis with the creation of man and woman. And there is a task given to man and woman to take dominion, right? Take dominion, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and take dominion. In other words, God charges Adam and Eve to make the whole world look like the garden, make the whole world look like heaven. This is their charge. But something happens. They fall. Sin happens. The curse corrupts, and it comes in, and they fail horribly at this mission. Instead of making the earth look like heaven, the earth begins to look more like hell. And it gets so bad that God says, okay, we're going to start over. So he sends the flood. Then you have Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and they come out of the ark, and God gives them the same charge. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, take dominion. And that goes okay for a little while, and then we have another fall with the Tower of Babel. So then God spreads the people out to the nations of the world. And he says, okay, I will accomplish this mission of making earth look like heaven through one man. So he chooses Abraham. And he gives him a promise. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to make you a great nation. And I'm going to bless you. Now, the land portion is what comes up a lot in the book of Judges. Because this is the land that they have gone into. Right? So the way in which God is going to make earth look like heaven is by giving them a land, making them a great nation, and sending them out to be a blessing to all the nations. Right? So it's going to happen that way. So what happens? You have Abraham. Finally, he has Isaac, and then Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, Joseph being one of them. He goes into Egypt. He prepares Egypt because of a great famine, invites the family to come in because they're starving, and then they make their home in Egypt, which was actually told to Abraham beforehand. They make their home in Egypt, and in Egypt, they become this great nation, thus fulfilling the promise given to Abraham. They become a great nation. However, what happens is they become too great, and the Egyptians are threatened, so they start to oppress them and put them under slavery. So then God brings in a redeemer. He brings in Moses to bring Israel out of Egypt. So you have Pharaoh and Moses, and you have the gods of Egypt and Yahweh going to war, the plagues and so on. And then finally, he lets them go. And they walk through the Red Sea, and then they go into the wilderness. Now, they are a great nation, and they're waiting to get into the land. So they wander for 40 years, wanting to get into the promised land. And they wander because of disobedience and grumbling. In fact, it got so bad that God told Moses, said, you know what, this generation, I'm done with you. You are faithless. You won't follow me. After everything I've done, I've brought you out of Egypt. You saw the plagues. You walked through the Red Sea, for crying out loud. But you're faithless and you grumble. So you're not going to make it into the promised land. Instead, it will be your sons. It will be their generation, which will be led by Joshua, right? So that generation goes away. Joshua takes the nation of Israel into the land. Finally, they've made it to the land, but they have to go to war because in this land is already occupied by Canaanites and Philistines and Jebusites and others. So they go to war, and this war is not like the wars that we see in our world today in the same way, but this is a powerfully spiritual war. You see, the Canaanites, they serve Baal. So when they would go to war, they weren't only going against the Canaanites, the people, but it was also a spiritual war of Yahweh against Baal. And we see this in Joshua, how the Lord fights for them, right? So this is called harem warfare. It's not killing just for the sake of killing, but it is moving out. It is battling the demonic powers that were occupying the land. So Joshua does this, and he works, and they all finally, the 12 tribes, they all come into the land. They are a unified people, and they had not yet driven everybody out. And Joshua dies, and the elders die, and those who came up next said, you know what? The Canaanites, they have really good education. They have good jobs. To worship Baal is a lot of fun. Let's not drive them out. Instead, let's just assimilate. Let's all come together and be one people. So these God's people ended up worshiping Baal, worshiping false gods, and causing Yahweh to be jealous and saying, what are you doing? So what does God do? He raises judges. And the judges then enter in to rescue Israel from the oppression of these other nations. All right, so this is the landscape. So you have Joshua that dies, then you have the judges over 400 years going to war with these different nations in the land of Canaan, in the promised land, as we wait for King David or King Saul to come and the monarchy to be set up. So that's the overall landscape, if you would, historical timeline of the judges. To put into some context, the judges between Joshua and the monarchy of Saul is about 400 years. And Samson, who's the last judge, he was a contemporary with Ruth and Boaz and Samuel as well, right? So they're all living right about that time. And Ruth is King David's grandmother. So you've got this connection that David is close by, right? By the time we get to the end of the Judges. So that's the historical structure. Now the structure of the book itself is fairly straightforward. It starts with two different introductions, okay, and then it has two different conclusions. And then in between, in the body or the meat of the book, you have the story of 12 different judges. You have 6 major judges, and then you have 6 minor judges. The major judges are considered major because they have more real estate in the book. There's more developed about their story. The minor judges sometimes only have 1 or 2 verses. Okay, so that's what's going in. That's the structure of the book. Excuse me. But you have the 12 judges, but you also have one anti-judge, which comes up in chapter 9. His name is Abimelech. So he kind of does this weird reversal of everything the judges are supposed to be doing. But as you read through the book, though the structure is pretty simple, with 2 introductions, 2 conclusions, and 12 judges, it can be disorienting as you read through it. Because the book of Judges works in these cycles, it cycles through, and not only does it cycle, but also kind of spirals out of control. All right, so the cycle of the Judges, we see a cycle take place with the 6 major judges, and the cycle looks like this, okay? We have it right up here. The cycle looks like this. Israel does evil in the eyes of Yahweh by abandoning him and serving the gods of the nations. This is what happens when Israel breaks covenant with God. Judges is actually, you could look at it almost like living illustrations or sermons of Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy 28, when God gives the law to Moses, in chapter 28, it is the blessings and the curses of what will come if you break covenant with God. So Deuteronomy 28 tells us this is what it looks like to break covenant with God, and then Judges, we see all of that lived out in the nation of Israel. Okay? So they do evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and then Israel's actions, their evil, provoke Yahweh to anger, and he sends a foreign nation against Israel to oppress them. These are like mini exiles, right? The nation of God, they go into exile multiple times in Judges. This foreshadows the great exile that comes with Babylon and Assyria and so on. And then after they're oppressed, the Israelites cry out to God for deliverance. The people repent of their unfaithfulness, ask for help. This is what happens when they're in Egypt as well, is that they cry out, God help us, and the Lord heard their cry and remembered his covenant, right? And that same sort of thing happens over and over again in Judges. The Lord hears their cry, remembers his covenant, and what does he do? He raises up a judge. So the judges he raises up go in and save Israel from their enemies. These are mini Exodus stories, right? They're in oppression. The judge comes in like a Moses figure and brings the people of God out. Then the land is finally at rest. And they're following the judge and they're obeying and things are good. And then the judge dies and the cycle starts over again. Israel begins to lose their mind. They start spiraling out of control. So the cycle repeats itself 6 different times in the book of Judges. Not only do we see this cycle happening, but there's also that spiral aspect where each time this cycle takes place, it is going deeper and deeper into depravity, deeper and deeper into sin. One of the main themes that we'll see multiple times throughout the book of Judges is the phrase, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That shows up every time the cycle begins, right? This is how it starts. And with each cycle, we see Israel spiraling downward into greater depths of depravity. Each cycle is worse than the previous one. In fact, by the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, we are what feels like rock bottom. The last verse in Judges, Judges 21-25 says this, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's like, oh man, what do we do? It just goes out of control. It goes all the way down to the bottom. This is a similar phrase to what we see in Genesis 6 before the flood, that everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. That all the desires of man's heart was evil continuously. So this is the cycle that takes place. And in fact, we'll look at chapter 2. We'll spend more time on this in weeks to come. But let me read through a couple verses in chapter 2, and we can see this cycle kind of condensed and brought together in one little passage. So look with me at Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 19. It says this, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. There's that phrase. And served the Baals, right? They not only did evil, but they're actually worshiping this demonic god, Baal. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers. They forgot the story. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. This is where God would allow Israel to go under the oppression of these other nations. And he sold them into the hands of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord has warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. That's Deuteronomy 28. And they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. This is the next part of the cycle. He raises up a judge to save his people, these Moses characters. They did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. See that right there, that verse 17, that again illustrates the power of story. The Psalms are full of this. Don't forget what God has done. Don't forget the story of your fathers. Don't forget the testimony of God and what he has done with your people. But here we see that they have forgotten that. They have not walked accordingly. Verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning, that's the crying out, because of those who afflicted them and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So that's where the cycle begins again. Okay? So that's the whole cycle that happens 6 different times in the book of Judges. Israel does evil in the eyes of God. They worship the Baals. God becomes angry and hands them over to an enemy nation. Israel cries for help. God has pity on them. He raises up a judge to deliver them. There's rest. And then the judge dies, and they go back into the cycle again and again. So, what we see in this cycle is something marvelous about God. It is God's faithfulness to his people. Because by the time we get to Samson, this cycle has so devolved, it's become so corroded that the people of God don't even cry out anymore. They don't even cry out. They don't even know if God exists at this point. The nation is so deplorable that they don't even know how to cry out to God. They're so steeped in worshiping the Baals and so on. But what does God do? He enters into their story, how messed up it is, says, I'm going to save you because I have made a covenant with you. I've made a promise to you, and I am faithful. Even though you are faithless, I remain faithful. I'm going to save you. So what does he do? He raises up a judge. You know, we live this out in our own lives. We live this cycle over and over and over again. And it is God's faithfulness that allows us to come back onto this path. How many times in your life have you had somebody, a friend, a spouse, a pastor, an elder, a message where God just takes you by the shoulders and shakes you and says, stop. Stop doing this. The path that you are walking is leading you toward destruction. It is leading you toward hell. Do not go down this path any longer. And we don't even ask for it. Yet God's faithfulness to us, to his people, is to bring us judges in the form of friends, in the form of community that will grab hold of us and show us what we're doing is wrong, whether we ask for it or not. And this is exactly what God does. He loves his people so much. He goes, my goodness, if I don't send you a judge, you will just die. You'll cease to exist. You'll become completely Canaanized. And you will forget about my faithfulness to you. So I'm going to bring a judge in. You don't deserve this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you a judge to pull you out of that swamp, that quagmire of death and destruction and depravity. This is God's faithfulness toward his people in Judges. This is God's faithfulness toward us today. This is the God that we serve, one who is faithful all the way to death. We serve a good God. So who are these judges? Well, we're gonna end with this. Who are the judges? I think one thing that has been really unfortunate in churches today is that the judges get a really bad rep. They have a really bad reputation. In fact, I've read commentaries that are built off of the premise that the judges are part of the problem, that they are anti-heroes, that they are sinful leaders that are unable to help God's people at all. The judges are an issue. And the judges really only stand to contrast Christ, who is the true judge, who is able to accomplish what these judges fail to do. Now, that preaches really well. The problem is it's not very biblical. We have to have our opinions formed not by popular opinion, but by what the text actually says. So what does the Bible say about these judges? Well, look with me quickly at the verses we just read. I'll read just a couple of snapshots. In verse 16, chapter 2, verse 16, it says, then the Lord raised up judges. The Lord did this. And why did he do it? To save them. These judges are men and women that God has raised up and has commissioned to save his people. This is a hero by biblical standards. This is a good thing. Verse 17, this is the nation of Israel, did not listen to their judges. The judges were there telling them the power, or telling them the truth and the law of God, but they would not listen, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. Verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge. The Lord was with the judge. And he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. So when the judge is on the scene, God is with them. This is God's man, this is God's woman that is an instrument in God's hand to save God's people. The people need the judges. They are not part of the problem, they are part of the solution. Verse 18, but whenever a judge dies, when that solution is taken away, what happens? They turn back and are more corrupt than they were before, more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods. You see, the judges are the ones that kept Israel in line. The judges was God's grace upon Israel to walk faithfully. These are not anti-heroes. These are not evil leaders. These are heroes of the faith. In fact, these judges represent God himself. As image bearers, their office is one that is perfectly seen in the person of God. Judges 11:27 says that the Lord, Yahweh, is the judge. He is the true judge. And these other judges are like mini judges that do the work of Yahweh. See, God himself, the true judge, is the one that has appointed these judges to point us to Christ, to point his people to faithful living, to faithful characters in this story. The judges are types of Christ who save his people from their enemies of Satan, sin, and death. And not only does the book of Judges itself have a positive outlook on the judges, but so does the New Testament. So does the New Testament. The New Testament testifies to the power and the heroic nature of these judges. But we don't think that way, right? I mean, who here has ever heard a Sunday school lesson, a sermon, or even read anything that says Samson was a great guy? Right? Well, see, I truly believe that Samson is probably one of the most Christ-like characters in all the Bible. See, we hear about Samson being this egotistical, womanizing, self-absorbed, muscle-bound freak, right? That is unable to to control his temper and so on. But we don't hear the stories of Samson and how he went into a foreign nation to rescue a bride in order to redeem the whole nation. We don't hear about that. We don't hear how Samson and Jesus are the only two people in all the Bible who tell parables that need to be interpreted. We don't hear the story about Samson and how in his death he conquered by pushing over pillars, and in his death he conquered more than he did in his life. His death accomplished salvation in a way that his life couldn't. See, we don't hear these parts of the story because our opinions are skewed. But our opinions are not from the Bible. And Hebrews tells us this, right? Look with me at Hebrews 11:32 through 34. It says, and what more shall I say? In the context, Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith, right? This is the who's who in the Old Testament. This is the great cloud of witnesses of chapter 12. These are the people who show us how to live right, right? We've gone through Abel and Abraham and David and Moses and so on. And by the time we get near the end, as a good preacher, he says, what more shall I say? Only if I had time, right? Which I'm going over time as well. So we're all running out of time here. For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. See, the author of Hebrews is on my side. He thinks Samson is a good guy. He's a hero of the faith that we should look at and say, man, what can I learn from him? What shall I say about these men who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, become mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight? It is these men that the author of Hebrews says, upon their death, that the world was not worthy of them. These are the men that God has put in place in this story to show us what it looks like to live faithfully, how to be good characters, how to be faithful characters in this story. These were the men and women that God set in place. Were they perfect? Of course not. Of course not. However, they were examples for us. They are examples for us. They are our mothers and fathers in the faith. And we must hear and learn from their stories so that we might grow up into Christ as mature men and women. As we travel through the book of Judges, there will be parts of the story that will cause us to cringe. There will be parts of the story that cause us to rejoice. There will be parts of the story that will make us feel very uncomfortable. However, the entire story is one that leads us to Christ, who is the true judge, the true king, the true deliverer. He is the one toward whom the judges point, and he is the one toward whom we must fix our eyes as we will go through this wonderful book. Amen? All right, let us pray.